Harshbhai, welcome to Book Talk. I'm delighted and honored to welcome you to this podcast where we're going to talk about your latest book, Mumbai Postcards. It's a beautifully designed book. You can also hold it up at your end if you like. And I want the audience to see that this is a book full of these mailboxes in red. We'll talk about that in a moment, but it's a uniquely conceived of and designed book because it's really postcards to your grandson Manu, isn't it?
That's correct.
In fact, the postcard itself as a genre is something that we are.
But it's not only to my Manu, but to all the Manus in the world. As I've said in my dedication, all the Manus in the world who spend their lives under an oak tree, but who may want to seek the roots of their ancestral people tree.
Exactly. So my first opening question to you is, how did you think of writing this book? Because there is a background to it. You moved to Canada, first to the US, then to Canada. When you were in your, I guess, 20s or early 30s, you settled down there. You keep moving back and forth. Your two sons were raised there and they're married. They've all settled down there. And you have a grandson, Manu, who is brilliant in all respects. But I guess you're afraid that Manu will grow up not knowing any of the India that you love and cherish so much.
So true. But I'll backtrack a little bit. Having lived in three Western countries almost continuously for 60 years, first in England, then in the United States, and now in Canada for 52 years. I thought it was time for me to sit on a rocking chair and think about the modern Western civilization that I've experienced and compare it with the Indian civilization that I know so well and I cherish so much. And as you correctly said, that there are a large number of people of Indian origin who live in the Western world. And I find that they are people of Indian origin, but I'm afraid to say not really Indian. I hate to say that. They come to India as tourists, they go back. I don't think they understand India as much as they should, but certainly not as much as both you and I know India so well. Uh, and therefore, I thought I would do a little fireside chat with these people. Nobody has time to read big essays on the eternal Bharat, which I would have loved to do. And therefore, a postcard of 10 lines, just to make a point or two. And it's not set in any chronological order. They can open the book wherever they want, read a paragraph, agree with me, disagree with me, but at least think about it. So that was why I thought I would write. And I've enjoyed doing this book. And I hope that people of all ages, particularly people, those who live outside India, would take time to read it, react to it, correct me if I'm wrong, or agree with me where I'm right.
Thank you. In fact, you've pointed out here, you quote Aristotle towards the end of the book,
Yes.
and you've also talked about the Indian tradition as being pluralistic, which encourages debate and discussion and even dissent.
Right.
So we'll come back to that later. But one of the things that I found interesting in your response is that the book is not just for Manu or the other Manus of the world, that is, children of Indian origin growing up in the US, but
Right.
it's also for Indians themselves who don't know they're India.
Absolutely. Like, I live in Mumbai, which is a large city, a metropolitan city. And while Indian tradition is alive and well, but it seems to be buried by these globalized Indians who live in India and behave like New Yorkers. Uh, but the advantage they have, which Indians living in North America don't have, is that they pick up the Indian tradition by osmosis, just by being there, by walking the streets, by visiting somebody where there's a grandfather, attending festivals, attending a marriage ceremony. These things happen all the time. And therefore, even if they are so called globalized Indians, they will pick up something by osmosis, which I'm
Yes.
afraid people living in North America or in the Western world are not able to do that as much as people living in India do. And therefore, the book, I think, is more valuable to those Indians, the NRIs, the OCIs, who are living in North America, Canada, or Britain, but who are interested in exploring their Indian values and roots.
Of course, but wouldn't you also say that the book is valuable, useful, insightful, even for Westerners, because you are, holding up a mirror, as it were, to their own face, and you're going deep into what Western civilization, with its underlying ethos and the current orientation during this period of modernity, is all about. So I think it's an East-West dialogue of a very profound dimension.
Indeed. I don't know about profound. It's written very simple words. It is not written in an academic style. And again, as somebody said, what right do I have to talk about the Western civilization? I'm not an academic trained in any Western philosophy, history, sociology, or whatever. But my answer to that is having lived both as a medical doctor, a professor of Indian studies, and as an ordinary citizen in these three countries, I have been in contact with a variety of people and have learned about the Western civilization through them rather than through books.
But Harshbhai, here, let me just, take you back to your, I would say, eminent qualifications for a meditation of this sort. You are a very well known medical practitioner in Ottawa, well loved by thousands, and a leading allergist. So let me start with, postcard. They're not numbered, but on page 14, I will just read a little excerpt, and that would be a way of getting into this dialogue, if you like. You say here on page 13, as I write this in the summer of 2023, Canada's much beloved healthcare system is in a crisis. Waiting lists for procedures and elective surgery are several months long. Wait times at the emergency are 15 to 18 hours. Ambulance response time can be up to 1 hour. Social services to the elderly and the disadvantaged are dwindling. And you go on like that. And then you say, why can't Canadians take a page from India? Traditional Indian society is built upon multi generational living and the building of communities. When father and son live in the same home, albeit in separate quarters, it is a win win situation for both. The elderly parents do not suffer loneliness and alienation, and the younger do not have to worry about babysitting. Now, as you know, Harshbhai, you start with the usual health crisis after the pandemic and so forth. But don't you think that one of the great crises in the Western world is actually loneliness?
Absolutely. This whole idea of a nuclear family, I, my wife, my two children, my station wagon, and the dog, as it used to be said, that's my family. Uh, and even when I first came to this continent and I saw some presidential elections, the president elect would hold his hand with his wife and stand in front of the nation. But where is the father? Where is the mother? Where are the grandparents? Where are the uncles, the nieces, the aunts of this person who's going to become president? No, it's just he and his wife holding hands. And then, of course, you know too well, this is entire society is built upon the concept of a nuclear family. And look at the disaster it is. And then I see it medically, I see it socially. Look at, as you correctly said, loneliness of old age. Compare dementia in India versus dementia in Canada. I see both. The demented person in India is surrounded by friends and family, by domestic help. The demented person in Canada is put in an 8 by 10 room where the family visits once a week, and the nurse looks at him for 10 minutes once a day. That is his fate. So look at that. But let's forget dementia. Look at even ordinary things. How many elderly people are living completely alone? Uh, and the son visits once a week, even living in the same city. But it doesn't solve the problem of day to day loneliness or day to day help or going to the doctor's office or going to the pharmacy, going to the food store to buy some grocery, things like that. Uh, they have such a hard time.
So
And
that brings
equally,
us.
the young couple is struggling with babysitting. They take children to daycare. Both parents are working. The child, a grown up child, comes home at 3 o'clock, one of these latchkey children, and just has a glass of milk and sits in front of the TV.
Well, Harshva, you have hit the nail on the head, as it were. And it brings us to the underlying or fundamental root or the source of this problem. And I would like to take our readers and viewers to page 24, another postcard of yours. And maybe this is, what is at the foundation of the different issues that you're discussing in the book. And if you allow me, I will read a little excerpt. Western society is all about the individual, his freedom, his growth, his likes and dislikes, his friends, and not so much about his family, his marriage, his work, and eventually his old age spent in isolation in a retirement home. I suppose there are moments of glory and happiness in this individualistic and nuclear lifestyle. By contrast, for us in India, our life is all about family, the community, our neighbors and neighborhoods, our elders, and even ancestors, our village. So, Harshbhai, would you say that hyper individualism, which is a very modern phenomenon, because
Yeah,
human beings lived in herds or in groups or in communities
absolutely.
for thousands and thousands of years. So, what about this individuality or hyper individualism?
Well, it has both a good and a bad side. Uh, Living in a nuclear family in a hyper individual kind of state, I progress quite nicely in my job, in my pastimes, in my time with my children and my wife, and so on. But at what cost? Uh, Most grandchildren living in North America have not lived with an older person. My own grandson sees me for 5 days in 1 year. Does he know the problems of an 85-year-old person walking, getting up, getting into the car, times of loneliness, times of maybe some depression? Uh, he doesn't know. But when you live with a grandfather or a grandmother, and sometimes great grandfathers, I know families in India where there are four generations or five in one home. So you see a variety of age groups struggling or enjoying their life in different ways. That doesn't happen here.
I couldn't agree with you more, Harshbhai. Actually, most modern societies do not teach us how to age. They do not even prepare us for death. And we talk about ageism nowadays. The fact is that by isolating young people or people who are, you might say, economically viable, we're doing a great disservice to our own humanity because we learn nothing from our, intergenerational family members or even neighbors. And in the West, sometimes you see an elderly person in a park bench, and even if they don't know you, they immediately start talking to you because they haven't spoken to anybody for days on end.
Absolutely. So true. So true. I'll give you a personal example. Uh, we decided to meet my wife's nurse who had retired. So we phoned her up and saying, Laurie, what are you doing? And let's have a little coffee somewhere. And so we met up and so we knew her dad quite well. So Laurie, how's your dad doing? Oh, she says he's getting on in age and he's being very forgetful and he leaves the home and suddenly I have to go and pick him up from somewhere. So I said, Laurie, the answer is simple. You have such a large home. You have a 1.5 apartments in your home. Your dad should move in with you. You know what? She hit the roof. Says, absolutely not. I'm not going to live with my dad. I want my privacy and my freedom. I think I'll put him in a retirement home. There you go.
So, Harshbhai, what about this issue of rationality? Because modern civilization is based on reason, the dominance of reason. That's why we called it the age of reason in Europe, the Enlightenment. So, let me go to another postcard. This postcard on page 53. Here you say, the Western mind is driven by intellect and rationality. It is not what we call bhava pradhan. The Indian mind, on the other hand, is driven by emotion and mysticism. It is bhava pradhan and guda pradhan, emotional and mystical. We do not negate buddhi, we do not discard rationality, but we're keenly aware that our mind has other realms, many other layers, above and beyond the intellect, that our mind is not a square box, but a mandala. Now, can you unpack this for us? Because there's so many things here. What does rationality do? What is the problem with reason?
You see, let me go back to my mentor, Kapila Vatsyayan. And in one of my many conversations with her, she said, we in the Indian civilization have two enemies from the Western civilization. So I said, who are those two? And she said, Descartes and Freud.
And Freud, correct.
So why Descartes? I think, therefore I am, ergo cogito sum. And Freud, in his insistence on that individual subconscious, is again re-emphasizing individuality. And as if it's not enough, sexuality. I said, come on. We in India don't posit the individual subconscious, we posit the universal unconscious or the agama, where millennia of tradition are stored in my mind as archetypes. And at the right time, they would express themselves either in thought or art or singing or dancing or whatever. And then when it comes to rationality, you know too well that there are spaces in our mind, in our awareness, in our consciousness, above and beyond rationality. As I said, there is emotion, there is mysticism, there is mystery. You can't solve every problem and question of the civilization and of mankind on a rational basis. We need to go into those irrational spaces of mysticism and so on to find some solutions to those questions, or say to ourselves, there are no answers. I'm going to be satisfied with that state of being where every question cannot have an answer. But no, the Western civilization is so keen, so hell bent on being rational, that they're missing out on the beauty of life.
So, Harshbhai, I want to pause you here. I'm glad you said irrational and not irrational, because there are many irrational movements all over the world which result in violence and fanaticism. So we are very far from that. But, speaking about Freud and sexuality, many discussions we've seen how in India we value sensuality and, kama and shringara, which is this rasa or emotion of beauty, of aesthetics. And you are the world's greatest expert on Krishna Shringara. And you have been telling us for, I would say, decades that one way to reach God is actually through beauty, through sensuality, through the dance of Radha and Krishna, of Shiva and Parvati. So, not the degraded sexuality that we see in pornography, but something elevating and beautiful. Can you tell us about that? How Indian civilization, even in its temples, has these sensuous damsels, people leaning on trees, the celebration of fertility, and the lack of guilt that has characterized sexuality in the Western civilization.
Absolutely. And the guilt, since you use that word, in the Indian civilization has come from two sources. One is the Islamic presence in India brought in with it the difficulty in accepting sensuality. And then, of course, the British, the Europeans who reigned over India for so many hundred years, the Victorian kind of sensibilities. Pure Hindu sensibility is to accept sexuality and sensuality as an important part of our life. Uh, and when it comes to sensuality, we indulge in sensuality not for its own sake, but because we want to be led to realms higher than sensuality, but through sensuality. We want to experience spirituality through sensuality. We want to experience spirituality through eroticism and so on.
Isn't that contradictory, though? A Westerner would say that's contradictory.
Correct. That's so true. But our gods are sensual, our temples are sensual. There are these Surasundaris all over the temple. Uh, Look at, you refer to Krishna Shringar. Look at how Krishna handles emotion, the emotion of love, the emotion of with the gopis or the milkmaids of Vrindavan. He encourages that. But then what does he do? After the rasa on Sharat Purnima, he disappears. So he encourages the sakar, the one with form, to become nirakar, the one without form. That is how sensuality becomes spirituality. You are not entrenched in sensuality. You affirm sensuality to become spiritual. You go from the sakar to the nirakar, the form to the formless.
It seems to me, Harshbhai, in our many discussions, we've come upon this over and over again that in the Indian aesthetic traditions, there is a refinement, not a denial of the senses, because the senses are very important instruments for us to know not just the world, but ourselves. And by refining them, by purifying them, eventually we can contemplate the beauty of the divine.
Absolutely. And look at what we did. In times ancient, the god of love for us was Kama or Kamdev with his wife Rati. And the spring festival was presided by the god of love. And we would venerate and worship the god of love in many different ways. But gradually, we realized that Kama not only fostered sensuality and sexuality, but also eroticism. So we gradually moved away from Kama and we met Krishna, the god of love. And look at how we made that correction in the Indian civilization. That sensuality and sexuality eventually had a higher purpose and was not to be used merely for material bodily pleasures. So, this whole idea of moving away from the finite to the infinite, from the form to the formless, from spoken words to silence, that whole movement is there in India all the time, starting from the Vedas down to the man on the street. Uh, and I find it fascinating that the completely unlettered man on the street, in his own simple, unlettered way, is speaking Vedanta. Uh, like one person told me in Hindi, साहब मेरे जिंदगी में बहुत दुख है. There is a lot of pain and suffering in my life. बहुत दुख है. मगर साहब मैं दुखी नहीं. Now look at that. That's pure Vedanta. I mean, how much better can it get?
In other words, he's saying that there's a lot of suffering in my life, but I'm not unhappy. That's a profound distinction.
Look at that. This is a man who's wearing a khaki short and a banyan and sitting on the footpath of Mumbai saying this. So here is an example of what I said of what is called that universal unconscious. The centuries, the millennia of Indian wisdom persists even in the so-called globalized, globe-trotting Indian. When he settles down, when he's quiet, he does realize that he's privy to so much Indian wisdom, and that the patina of modernization is very, very superficial.
So now let's jump towards the end of the book. Of course, these postcards are not meant to end because they're really reflections on not just a cross cultural reality that many of us face, but about deep existential questions. So on page 128, you say, and I'm quoting you, there is widespread existential despair, loneliness, and suffering in the Western modern project. It cannot turn around to its medieval roots, committed as it is to technology and intellectuality, like Lucky's wordless speech in Waiting for Godot, or the final scream in Bergman's Cries and Whispers. The modern Western person can only express its anguished cry. Now, these are very powerful images. I'm also reminded of Edward Monk's painting The Scream, where the anguish of modernity is so severe that there are no words for it. It's almost inexplicable. And Kierkegaard and others have talked about this, almost the edge of language, because the emptiness, they talk about a godless world, a world without meaning, a world without a center, a world without purpose, maybe. Now, we have talked about the rasas of modernity, and you've often talked about despair as the rasa or the dominant emotion of modernity, and I've tried to tweak it. I've said it's alienation, going back even to Marx. What is the way out, Harshbhai, of this alienation that seems to be at the root of the modern Western project? And let's, sorry, go ahead.
Now, we spoke about multi-generational living. That's a sociologic uh, therapy, if you like, for modernity. But uh, in one of my new books, which is not yet out, it's in print, where I've taken 10 Indian painters, modern Indian painters, and tried to show that other than despair, there are other ways in which we are dealing with modernity. For instance, there's a notable painter called Patwardhan in Mumbai, and he celebrates banality, the ordinariness of life. A man sitting on a bench outside a railway station doing nothing. I mean, he thinks it's a wonderful thing, that person. Um, Number two, not forgetting our Adivasi, our the ancient, what do you call them in English?
The Aboriginals, the First Nations, the indigenous people.
So there again, look at how they still live. Look at the Warlis, look at the Gonds, look at the Adivasis of Gujarat. Uh, there are so many still there, and there's something to be learned from their way of life, particularly the way they look at the earth, the trees, the nature, and so on. And then, what about the beauty of ordinary objects of life? The ordinary kalash, the ordinary pot, the ordinary comb that was made so beautifully, little things of life that were so lovingly made, like a quilt made by taking old saris and women getting together and making a little receiving blanket for a new child. I mean, here are everyday things still very much present in our lives, which we should study, we should admire, we should venerate, and we should make it a part of our life to dispel some of the negatives of modernity. Now, it goes without saying that we're not going to dismiss modernization. We are talking on Zoom, which is itself is a product of modernization. Uh, and I'm not going to deny the comforts that I get from many modern things. But I want my mind to be like a palimpsest where the ancient and the modern can coexist. The ancient will exist like the faded writing on a slate, so that whenever needed, I can dip into it. I don't want to be totally modern. I want to be modern and ancient at the same time, which we can very easily do in India. I have to do living in Mumbai is drive 100 miles, and I'm in the midst of nature. I'm in the midst of the Warlis, uh, talking to them about their lifestyle, about things which a modern person in Mumbai would never talk about. So, to be modern and ancient at the same time, I think, is the key to having a beautiful life, even in times modern.
Exactly. And this is what you wish for Manu and all the Manus of the world. But just a couple more points. I think we are at a very interesting juncture in our conversation because I think what you're hinting at is that the fundamental difficulty with modernity is how it alters our relationships. You know, the relationship of man with nature, of man with supernature, the divine, the world of the gods, or, the world of mystery and magic, the world of the ancestors, and how it alters the relationship between human beings themselves, man and woman, father and son, mother and daughter. And what we need, I think, is to change these relationships so that we bring in beauty and respect and reverence and dignity, mutuality and
Compassion, compassion.
compassion. And this is possible, is what you're saying.
This is what I'm saying. You see, because in an excessively ethical world, which the modern Western world is, because it prides itself on ethics, there's no corruption, there's law and order, fine. But when you take a stand on ethics, you are likely to say that, look, I've not broken any laws. I'm paying my taxes. I'm a good neighbor. I'm not making too much noise, uh, and all of that. So why should I walk the extra mile? Why should I go out and help somebody who is in need? No. In India, maybe our sense of ethics is contextual rather than absolute. But it is that very contextual ethics that brings in compassion. Let's say uh, my office here in Ottawa, we close down at 6 p.m. and somebody walks in at 10 after 6. I'm still in the office working away, finishing my work. But the nurse says, oh, it's 6 o'clock, I'm leaving. I said, well, wait a minute, this patient has just walked in. She said, no, no, our office is closed. I said, no, no, no. I mean, he's walked in, probably he's late for some good reason. Let's see him. Let's show him some compassion. Or in India, I entered a crowded compartment and the bench has only space for 4 people. So I said, chalo bhai, thoda adjust kar lo. Move a little bit and make room for me. So 5 people sitting on a bench where 4 should sit. You see, adjust kar lo is showing compassion. That is, in being excessively ethical, we are losing compassion.
And we become excessively bureaucratized. Everything is by the book. And there's exactly, and there is no adjustment, as you say. In fact, just for our readers and viewers' benefit, I must also say that you point out to all the different troubling as well as problematic things in India. The corruption, the inefficiency. So it's not as if you're whitewashing. It's not an idealized East versus West. But let me ask you this. I want to push back a bit. When I
But
look
on
at
that
you.
point, may I, Makran, if I'll take only a minute,
Yes, yes, please.
that, the Western world is a world of what I call half truths, Ardha Satya. It is not a world which even understands Purana Satya or the full truth. So when I asked somebody, how do you convert half truth into a full truth? He said, very simple. So double it. Half a truth becomes the full truth. I said, no. So then he asked me, well, how do you convert half a truth into a full truth? So I said, you take half a truth, combine it with the opposite half truth. That becomes the full truth. Day, right now, this is daytime. It is only half a truth because soon it'll be night. I'm alive and well. I may not be alive and well. I am privileged and comfortable materially, but there are many people who are not. So when you combine two opposites, it makes the full truth. This
So,
is the Indian viewpoint.
Harshva, this is actually very profound, and it was, touching on exactly what I wanted to say. Like I would put it, to you that now it is more than 105 degrees in Delhi, and suppose I were to ask a person who's, in a shack and is sweating it out in the sweltering heat. I mean, how do you make your half truth a full truth? You know what he's going to say? Sir, give me an air conditioner. Now, which was invented by Mr. Carrier out in Texas, I guess. So my point is precisely this, that half truth of Canada or USA and the half truth of India is what makes the full truth.
Absolutely. But even in India, I mean, I'm having a luxurious meal in a fancy club, and I come out and I see a child drinking from a puddles of water on the footpath. It immediately sensitizes me that my having a luxurious meal in an air-conditioned five-star place is not the full truth. There is poverty in the world, and I have to somehow deal with it. I'm not going to ignore it. I'm not going to plaster it over. I'm not going to say it's not my job to look after the poor person drinking puddles of water. In my consciousness, in my awareness, both have to coexist. The luxury of my life, the poverty on the streets. And somehow the full truth will emerge from that.
Exactly. And in fact, let me now return to this beautifully designed book. And when I look at its back cover, it has actually a photo from Shimla, where I spent some time, as you know, and where you visited us. Now, Harshpai, here is the, so to speak, ironic Ardha Satya that we have been talking about, which is this, defining motif in your book, the red mailbox, which you have photographed in many different sites and venues, and has become actually the metaphor for your book, Postcards. The very postcard was invented by the West and came to India because of British colonialism, as did the modern mail service. And this, so my point is that the very means, the very vehicle of conveying your thoughts, the very metaphor of the mail and the mailbox is Western. In other words, the paradox of the book is that this very deep reflection on what it means to be Indian and the values of Indian civilization, the enduring values, the eternal values of India in a modern world, are also somehow, if not contingent, they are somehow, as it were, should I say, mediated, because this is about mail, it's about communication, like we are doing it through Zoom. All of these methodologies of mediation and communication are somehow the products of the modern world, and therefore, what I wouldn't put words in your mouth, but I think there's a seductive quality to modernity. There is, and yet it's incomplete, and therefore, I would think that one of the messages of your book is that in our effort, in our struggle, in our striving to reach completion, we need a different kind of cosmopolitanism, a different kind of alter modernism, if you will, which doesn't reject the past, which doesn't completely in a reductive fashion, get locked into individuality or individualism, but something that is not just synthetic, but something that is very open to the possibilities inherent in the human condition itself.
Absolutely wonderfully said. I knew that, Makran, that when I knew that I was going to be talking to you, my half truths would become full truths, thanks to you. And you used the word honored when we started this conversation. I'm going to turn around and say, I feel honored to be with you in this conversation.
Thank you, Harsh Bhai. We wish you many more books. In your 80s, I think your best work is waiting to come out. I'm aware of some of it, and especially the work on Krishna Shringar, on how beauty takes us to eternity. We look forward to more conversations with you.
In that effort, I need your blessings and the blessings of all your listeners.
Always, always. Thank you, Harsh Bhai. Thank you.